So for today's lesson, we're going to be working on solving cubic equations. Here, for our first example, this is the most basic equation you will ever get, and this is going to be the easiest type. So right now we have x cubed, and I'm going to try to isolate x. The way you're going to do that is by taking the inverse operation. Right now, x is being cubed, so the inverse operation of that would be to take the cube root of both sides. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like a square root symbol, except now in order to differentiate between the two, I'm going to go ahead and write a 3 right there. So now I know the difference between a square root symbol and a cube root. So I'm going to go ahead and do it to the other side as well. Again, it looks like a square root symbol, except I'm going to place a 3 right there. So what is the cube root of x squared? The answer would be x. Here, what's the cube root of 8? Well, what's happening is we're looking for a number that if I multiply by itself 3 times, it gives me 8. Hopefully the number you come up with is 2, because 2 times 2 is 4, but times 2 again will give me 8. So I'm going to say x equals 2. But I'm pretty sure some of you are thinking, well, Miss Sang, when we took the square root of an answer, there was 2 answers. So should I also write a -2 as part of my answer? Well, let's see. If I were to multiply -2 3 times, will it give me a positive 8? Well, -2 times -2 is 4. 4 times -2 is -8. So does -8 equal 8? The answer is no. So what you're going to notice is there is only one answer. Okay, we're not going to say x equals positive and -2. So one thing you want to keep note of is this. When you take the square root of a number, let's just say x, there are 2 answers, usually. Okay, and we will go into detail why I'm saying usually 2 later down the road. But when we take the cube root of a number, and again we'll call it x, you're going to notice there's only one answer. Oops, forgot to put an S right here. So that's one thing to keep in mind. When we're taking the square root, there's 2 answers usually. And when we take the cube root of a number, there's only one answer. So now let's look at example number 2. Example number 2 is actually almost identical to example number 1, except now it equals a -8 instead of a positive 8. So I'm actually going to do the same steps. I'm going to try to isolate x, and the way to do that is to take the cube root of both sides, because that's the inverse operation of x cubed. Again, I'm going to do to both sides. So the cube root of x cubed is just x, and here the cube root of -8, well, guess what? We kind of already seen it here. When we multiply -2 3 times, it gave us a -8. So here our answer would be -2. And again, it's because -2 times -2 times -2 equals -8, because this equals 4. 4 times -2 is -8. So please notice the difference between the two. Now let's look at number 3. Number 3 is going to be a little bit different than number 1, number 2, because they have one additional feature, which is the additional term called the constant. So in order to make it just as easy as the first 2 problems, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the constant by doing the inverse operation. Right here it says x cubed -2. So the inverse operation of subtracting 2 would be to add 2 to both sides. Positive 2 and -2 become 0, which leaves me with x cubed equals, here there's more positives than negatives, so my answer is going to be positive. And I can see that there's one more positive than there is negative, so I'm going to say 1. But now I'm going to have to take the cube root of both sides in order to isolate x. Tight squeeze right there. Take the cube root of 1. So here, the cube root of x cubed is x, and the cube root of 1 is just 1. And again, to prove my point, 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1, because you need to multiply it 3 times by itself. Okay, now let's look at example number 4. Number 4 is going to seem a little bit challenging because there's a fraction, but I want you to understand it's not challenging at all. The tip is you want to first read the equation out loud. So here, this I would read as x cubed divided by 2. So most of you would read this as x cubed over 2, which is correct. However, the reason why I'm choosing to read this as x cubed divided by 2 is because now I can tell what operation is occurring. And why would I want to know that? If I know it, then I can determine what the inverse operation is. So here, if I'm dividing by 2, the inverse operation would be to multiply by 2. So I'm going to go ahead and put 2 over 1 so I can see that the 2's cancel out. I'm going to go ahead and multiply 2 to the opposite side as well, which will leave me then with x cubed equals, here, negative 500 times 2 would be negative 1,000. I now, in order to isolate x, I'm going to have to take the cube root of both sides. So here it's going to leave me with x equals, well, first of all, the only way I can multiply a number 3 times to give me a negative answer is to start with a negative number. So I'm going to go ahead and mark it as a negative. Now the number that I can multiply by itself 3 times to give me negative 1,000 is 10. So it'd be negative 10. Okay, because negative 10 times negative 10 is 100, but 100 times negative 10 would give me negative 1,000. So again, notice there's only one answer. I can't say 10 because a positive 10 times a positive 10 times a positive 10 would be a positive 1,000, and that's not what I'm looking for. So again, remember, for the square root, there's 2 answers, but for the cube root, there's only one answer. Now, let's go ahead and make it a little bit more difficult. So now they included a constant for us. It looks exactly like number 4. There's a fraction, and there's a constant. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and get rid of the constant, so it can kind of look like number 4. In order to do that, I'm going to have to do the inverse of adding 8, which is to subtract 8 from both sides. These will combine to be 0, so they basically eliminate each other out, leaving me with this should be cubed, x cubed over 3 equals, here there are more positives, and let's see how many more positives there are. 251 minus 8, I must borrow, this becomes a 4. 11 minus 8 is 3, 4 minus nothing is 4, 2 minus nothing is 2. So it's going to leave you with 243. So again, here I'm going to have to isolate, I'm attempting to isolate x, so the first thing I want to do is get rid of this right here. And the way I do that is I read this out loud. This would be x cubed divided by 3. So the inverse of dividing by 3 is to multiply both sides by 3. Here, they cancel each other out. I'm going to go ahead and multiply 3 to the other side. Again, this becomes my side work. I'm going to do 243 times 3. 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 3 is 12. Carry the 1. 2 times 3 is 6 plus 1 is 7, which leaves me with 3 cubed equals 729. Not quite finished just yet. I still need to take the cube root of both sides. So x equals. So here, since it's a positive number, my answer is going to be a positive number as well, because a positive times a positive times a positive will give me a positive. It's not going to be negative because, as we can see here, when we multiply a negative 3 times, it will give me a negative answer. So here, some of you may not know this off the top of your head. However, the answer is going to be 9. Why? Because 9 times 9 is 81. And if I multiply 81 times 9, that would give me 729. And you can check that out if you want to check my work. Now, let's try the very last problem. So here, it's not that intimidating because we don't see a fraction, but guess what? We kind of follow the same steps. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the constant first. That's the thing you want to do first most of the time. I'm going to do that by doing the inverse of adding 12, which in this case would be to subtract 12 from both sides. It's going to leave me with 2x cubed. This becomes 0, so I'm not going to write that down. Here there are more negatives than there are positive, and there's 2 more negatives. Now, in order to isolate x, the first thing I'm going to have to do is get rid of the 2. And the way I do that is I view this as 2 times x cubed. By recognizing that, I can see that since it's multiplying, the inverse would be to divide both sides by 2. 2 divided by 2 becomes 1, so it leaves me with x cubed equals, here a negative 2 divided by 2 is a negative 1. And again, please do not stop too early. You still need to isolate x, and the way to do that would be to take the cube root of both sides. So here the cube root of x cubed is just x, and the cube root of negative 1, well, let's see, what number could I multiply by itself 3 times to give me a negative 1? Well, hopefully you recognize an answer has to be negative, because if it was positive, then this number would be positive. So let's see, what can I multiply by itself to give me a 1? Hopefully you see that the answer is a negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is 1, times another negative 1 would give me the negative 1 that I need. So my answer is x equals negative 1. So before we end, I still need to stress that you understand here that when we take the square root of a number, there's 2 answers, but when we take the cube root of a number, there's only 1 answer. And another main difference is I can take the cube root of a negative number. You've seen it several times here. I took the cube root of a negative 1,000. I took the cube root of a negative 8. I also took the cube root of a negative 1, and there is a solution. But notice, when we take the square root of a negative number, we write no solution. So please understand the difference between the two. If there's any questions, feel free to ask me. I hope this helps you. Thank you for tuning in.